The History of Education Reform and How Education Can Adapt for the Future by Wright Bailey. Today we're going to be talking about the history of education reform, some current issues in the field, what comes next, and what can you do? For centuries, classrooms were considered primitive and non-reactive to social changes. To the right is actually an image of an early colonial classroom from the 1600s, and what this is describing to us is that curriculum was largely non-existent and people were educated either by their family groups or by their local parishes. Early colonial classrooms used curriculum based on Calvinism that taught morality and social values but neglected all other subjects. Before the advent of the modern classroom, the Bible was used to teach students to read. Many of these Bibles did not use standardized language, and thus literacy was not widely taught by lay people, meaning it's difficult to teach people language with one book if the language itself is not standardized. In the 19th century, politician and lawyer Horace Mann pioneered education reform in the United States. Mann lobbied for state-sponsored education that was funded by taxes and taught all social classes and religions. Horace Mann believed that all people should have a right to a free and accessible education. He created a system of common schools in which there was supposedly a uniform curriculum. This became the gold standard in U.S. education for nearly 2 centuries. It wasn't until the early 20th century that education began to finally move away from regional influences and began to be influenced greatly by academic professionals. What this means is that the policymakers who were once strictly politicians were now educators themselves, so teachers were finally having a say-so in teaching. In the 1900s, small one-room schools with unique curriculum became less common, and education reform that focused on students learning standard subjects became more widespread. With the founding of the Federal Security Agency, the precursor to the U.S. Department of Education, many state education departments for the first time standardized required teacher training. Since the 1930s, education reform has continuously improved the state of students' education, but there's still a long way to go. Current issues in the field of education reform. Although education has come far, it has a long way to go. Familiar issues still permeate schools across the U.S. today. Today, schools face a social and political crisis that threatens the future of thousands of students every year across the country. Surprisingly, many of the issues in the educational system in America were present centuries before standardized educational systems. And below, we'll see some very familiar images of dilapidated and rundown schools and schools that have been closed due to public health emergencies, which are issues that have been dealt with in the past in the school system. Common issues include failing infrastructure, public health emergencies, and political pressure to alter or regress education reform. In other words, the politicians with the most money in their pockets get to make the decisions. For a long time, this has been the norm for education, and educators would like to make it so that educators are the ones who influence education and not just politicians. Many students facing financial difficulty may end up truant or drop out of school together. This trend has continued since the 1800s, when many young students left school to tend their family farms. Although reform has helped, school infrastructure continues to fail and leaves many intercity students sitting at broken desks and using outdated or damaged textbooks. In the middle is a chart from California from 2012 and 2013 that describes elementary school truancy rates based on the social demographics those people actually lived in. So as you can see, some counties have a nearly 50% truancy rate. That means 5 out of 10 students are not going to school. Even though it is the law that these students go to school, the parents are not helping to enforce this because of their social status. So what comes next? The U.S. Census Bureau estimates that the population of the United States, which currently sits at 328 million, is expected to grow by 80 million over the next 4 decades. If this statistics actually becomes a reality, the U.S. will face a population of 20 million young people in the next 10 years that will be entering a degraded and outdated education system. That means that the U.S. has 1 decade to develop a well-developed plan to improve schools, to revamp education, and to protect the educational futures of students before 2030 arrives. So what can you do? The best thing we can do as Americans is to vote for educational reform. Your vote matters, and the status quo can only be changed by electing those who desire positive, progressive change. So get out and vote so your children will see a better future.